Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We have some audience questions I would love to ask the panelists. The first one is, what lessons can be learned and identified from CNI protection initiatives from elsewhere in the world?
Chris, I'd like to kind of just, sort of open the floor with a little bit of a commentary on that. There's a lot of activities going on with regards to, sort of understanding really the breadth and depth of critical national infrastructure and what needs to be done, some of those initiatives around it. I think, if we were to start to take a look at the lessons that can be identified and learned collectively, regardless of market segment or anything like that, is, just having, number one, an understanding of really, what is the impact and what are the dependencies that organizations have on critical national infrastructure, whether it's food supply, whether it's fuel supply or other types of energy resources, whether it's access to transportation, water, anything like that. Really sort of understanding collectively within an organization or an entity or even a country, those dependencies is a good first step, a good lesson to kind of start to take up. And then secondly, I would think that I would say that a process of educating people about, whether it's users or systems administrators or anything like that, educating people just sort of how the impact on critical national infrastructure assets really can domino very quickly and have a broad impact across the population. I think that's the first lesson. That creates the awareness that people need to have when it comes to then trying to implement some protection strategies around them.
Definitely.
One thing I would add as well is, I find like lots of people are still struggling to understand just what it is that they're protecting, right? And what is that attack surface that is kind of exposed out. So to Tom's point, I think having that visibility, if you don't even know what you're protecting, it's going to be really hard to protect it, right? And we still find cases where you've got aging kind of infrastructure that hasn't been updated, hasn't been maintained, and frankly, in a lot of cases, people don't even know it exists necessarily. So that's just a quick tidbit that I'd throw out as well.
I think if I may add here that the risk on critical infrastructure is it does exceed the financial risk that falls on companies. It does actually affect the whole national infrastructure, which means it affects countries' sovereignties, it affects livelihood of people living there. So leaving that risk to be only calculated by the financial risk on the companies is something that we need to move from and look at it as collective risk on the critical infrastructure overall.
I would agree. I remember when I was at GISEC and I mentioned that if a company fell involved in critical infrastructure, it wasn't just the impact immediate or logistics, but also that we all have a responsibility as employers to look at the impact on our employees and ensure that they still have jobs and we can recover with those jobs intact. Because some companies, at least in the United States, have gone out of business because they just couldn't afford the remediation and attack. And so they were just poof, gone. And so were the jobs that were associated with it. And it was a real shame that in some areas of the world, they concern themselves more with the financial impact to the company versus the overall holistic view of what's involved in supporting that company and who's tied to that company. Now, we have another question. It's a comment and a question that the hacked water system in the United States and Florida was gained via an unmaintained operating system, Windows 7, not protected by a firewall. It had remote maintenance software that was left installed. Apparently, they didn't know about that. Or know enough about the risks associated with it. And lots of different people use the same username and password to access it. So what are some of the ways that we can mitigate that particular risk?
Yeah, I'll kind of go back to something we said earlier, right? Which is, I think there's a lot of these soft targets that are, not considered, kind of defense necessarily, right? It's the water system, it's the food supply system, etc. And again, I think part of the challenge is just raising awareness within these segments and how they fit. I think thinking about the supply chain more broadly, I think, in the US, for instance, you're starting to see a lot more focus on what does the supply chain look like, and which are critical components of it. Again, not to sound like a broken record, right? But the idea of visibility, I think, is just so critical. To being able to effectively protect this. And then another thing we touched on during the panel was the kind of the layer 8 problem, right? Which is like, do you have the awareness among your employees, among your even your IT staff, right? That every click that they execute on is potentially putting the organization and maybe an entire city in this case, or county, at risk. There's definitely multiple aspects to this.
I think if we look at this attack, I cannot speak of this specific attack, or I'm not sure about the details of what happened, but usually what we've seen in the past is we should always go back to the basics. System sanitization, we need to ensure that you have two-factor authentication and all that. That's going to take care of a lot of your problems. Number two is visibility. You need to have continuous monitoring. You need to know exactly, you need to know your assets. If we go back to the basics and ensure that we're in compliance, not to some external entity, but to some sort of internal, maybe company policies that just covers the basics, we'll take care of a lot of these external attacks that might come in.
Yeah, I would also add to this, back to the comment about the layer 8 problem being the human element here in the training. I mean, I remember reading about this particular event, and a small municipality in the U.S. state of Florida had a situation where you had potential significant risk, which would have affected the water supply. The panic that comes about as a result of something as basic and critical to human life as water, whenever that can be potentially compromised, is pretty difficult to contain when you haven't dealt with that proactively. I think in this case, you can do it based on the comments that have been received from the audience, but also just understanding what happened back there. This was something where an IT staff member put in place a process that it sounded like just sort of made life a little bit easier instead of following some basic processes. Oftentimes, these smaller municipalities don't necessarily have the financial wherewithal to invest in ongoing training for their staff, things like that. Oftentimes, the staff members are saddled with multiple duties that they have to handle all the time. So shortcuts are put in place to make things easier. And as we can see in this instance, it presented a fairly grave risk to a community's water supply. Having some really standardized training processes for individuals that are responsible for and charged with the protection of critical resources, critical national infrastructure, critical local infrastructure, if you want to call it that, is pretty important, number one. Number two, doing a continuous, we talk about continuous monitoring, at a minimum, a continuous review of the infrastructure that you have in place, a continuous type of training for individuals to understand what really kind of is and isn't an appropriate set of processes or things to do within an enterprise, even of this relatively small a size. These are some basic things that can be done to try to mitigate some of the problems. And I think also at the end of the day, there has to be an ownership. There has to be an ownership at all levels in an organization where you have dependency on or the delivery of critical national infrastructure. That ownership of the protection of the environment, to include the cyber protection of the environment, needs to permeate across the entirety of that organization. When the CEO, the managing director, the minister of whatever that particular organization is, understands the vulnerabilities and the impact, and they have a sense of ownership of making sure that protection happens, that goes a long way towards helping to drive some of the mitigations that are needed.
Yeah, no, definitely. This morning, while I was getting ready, I watched the Senate hearing with the CEO of the Colonial Pipeline. And it was very interesting that he was blaming it on a legacy VPN device that they supposedly couldn't find with any of their pen tests, which, by the way, I would probably go back to the pen test company and go, what the heck? Because someone was able to find it on the outside. And I've seen this before in other organizations and part of critical national infrastructure where they paid a lot of money for a pen test, but the pen testing company did not have the attacker perspective and didn't use, say, even the basics of open source intelligence gathering. And so it had single factor authentication. It was wholly outdated and an old piece of kit. So I think the Dubai Electronic Security Center with their booth at GISEC said it best: protect your assets. Right. We have one last question. As we consider critical national infrastructure across the Middle East, do Middle Eastern governments have a large appetite for using IoT technologies in critical infrastructure development?
So I guess I'd like to start with an opinion. I really think that given the importance of critical national infrastructure to national sovereignty in the Middle East, I'm definitely of the belief that the level of awareness around protecting these types of resources and understanding what has to happen, what has to be done, is fairly significant across the Middle East region, and particularly within the GCC countries. There is a real keen insight into the impact of cybersecurity threats against critical national infrastructure. I've talked to a number of different ministers and department heads, organization heads over there, and it's actually kind of refreshing to see there's this understanding at all levels of the differences between IT and OT, and where that handshake occurs, and why you need to have the enforcement of certain types of network segmentation and separation, but at the same time, there is a collective understanding of the importance of protecting this. So I believe, and I'm of the opinion that you see a lot of awareness and understanding of that. I believe that the wherewithal exists within these Middle East countries to invest in not only the technologies, but invest in the processes and invest in the people. There's a real keen interest in driving cybersecurity education and offering the different types of training, whether it's with organizations like the Dubai Electronic Security Center, whether it's with the Telecommunications and Regulatory Authority over there. All of them really have a keen interest in protecting an environment that is so critical to national economy and national sovereignty.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'll pick on the
IoT. Sorry, go ahead, Rodo.
No, go ahead, no, sir.
Yeah, so if I might add on the OT kind of perspective, in the industrial control system spectrum so far, we haven't seen so many IoT kind of devices coming in, but with the Industrial Revolution 4.0 and smart cities kind of popping all over the Middle East, we're going to see a lot of reliance on the IoT devices. Yet, securing these devices are totally different than securing regular IT systems or industrial control systems, because there's it's mostly static communication. I'm not going to say it's easier to protect, but it requires a different subset of skills that it's really lacking in the world right now. Now, do we understand the risk? Yes, it seems like we are ahead of that in the region. From control system perspective, we in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia, we have a lot of reliance on petrochemicals, oil and gas infrastructure, and water desal. And I guess the amount of control systems that we have currently in the region is maybe surpass a lot of countries around the world. which means that we have to take care of, or maybe we are targeted more, or by just statistics, that if there's anybody that's going to be targeting industry control system agnostic of all the geopolitical issues that we have, that we're going to see something here again. And the Trisus incident that happened in 2017 actually gave everybody like this shock that they need to do to go ahead and act more and go ahead and understand district control system risks more. Now, in the future, once we start seeing more IoT devices, once we start seeing more smart metering systems and all that, attacks are going to change. I'm not saying from a geopolitical perspective, but also from criminals, people that try to maybe fool the systems, but people that try to maybe make some quick buck out of maybe the smart metering system, or fool the billing system somehow. These are all risks that is going to be very real very soon in the future, and we need to be prepared for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We have to prepare for the next panel, but it has been a pleasure, gentlemen, talking to you and to the audience. Thank you so much.